Businessman forces his son to live as a beggar for a month. In the end, they both end up learning a lesson. See what happened. Subscribe to receive all our exciting story. Blake Morrison stood in his father's mahogany-paneled office, his designer clothes and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to the rough sleeping bag and worn backpack at his feet. At 23, he'd never wanted for anything until now. "You can't be serious," Blake said, staring at his father, Richard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Developments, who sat behind his imposing desk with an expression carved from stone. "Living on the streets for a month? This is insane even for you." Richard leaned forward, his steel-grey eyes reflecting decades of hard-earned success. "You wrapped your Porsche around a tree last night, Blake. That's the third car this year. You were lucky to walk away without a scratch. But I'm done watching you waste your life. So your solution is to make me homeless." Blake's voice cracked with disbelief. "I thought you'd just cut off my allowance or something." "You've had everything handed to you since birth," Richard replied, his voice steady but intense. "Private schools, luxury cars, unlimited credit cards, and what have you done with it? Party your way through college, crash expensive cars, and show up hungover to the few board meetings you actually attend." Blake felt his face flush. "I graduated, didn't I? Barely. And in the 6 months since then, you've shown zero interest in learning the business. You think money grows on trees, that success is your birthright." Richard stood up, walking around his desk. "You need to understand the value of a dollar, son. More importantly, you need to understand the value of people." "This is crazy," Blake protested, running his hands through his hair. "You want me to live like a homeless person for a month? What about my apartment, my things? All suspended. Your credit cards are frozen, your apartment is being sublet, and your phone service ends tonight. You'll get a basic prepaid phone for emergencies only." Richard picked up the backpack, handing it to his son. "Inside, you'll find a sleeping bag, some basic clothes, and $200 in cash. That's more than many people have." Blake took the bag, his hands trembling slightly. "And if I refuse, then you're cut off. Permanently? No trust fund, no inheritance, no future position in the company?" Richard's expression softened slightly. "I'm doing this because I love you, son. You're on a destructive path, and I won't stand by and watch you throw your life away." "Some love," Blake muttered, but he knew his father meant every word. Richard Morrison didn't make idle threats. "1 month starting tomorrow morning. You can't use your name or connections. You have to find your own food, your own shelter. Experience life without the safety net you've always taken for granted." Richard handed him a burner phone. "Check in every 3 days, so I know you're alive. If you make it through the month, really learn from this experience, we'll talk about your future in the company." Blake stared at the simple phone, so different from his usual latest model smartphone. "And if something goes wrong, if I'm in real trouble, the phone has my number programmed in. 1 call, and it's over. But so is your chance at the trust fund and your place in Morrison Developments." The gravity of the situation finally hit Blake. His father was serious, dead serious. Tomorrow morning he would be homeless, living on the streets of Boston with nothing but a backpack and $200 to his name. "This is cruel," Blake said, his voice barely a whisper. "Life is cruel for many people, son. Maybe it's time you learned that firsthand." The next morning, Blake stood on a street corner in downtown Boston, wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt that still smelled of the department store. His expensive watch, designer wallet and signet ring were locked in his father's safe. The only things he had were what he could carry in his backpack. The morning crowd rushed past him, business people hurrying to their offices, coffee cups in hand. Yesterday, he would have been one of them, nursing a hangover in his corner office while his assistant handled the day's responsibilities. Now, he was invisible, worse than invisible. People actively avoided looking at him, creating a small bubble of space around him and his backpack. "Hey, man, you're in my spot." Blake turned to find a weathered-looking man in his 50s, watching him with tired eyes. The man's clothes were worn but clean. his grey beard neatly trimmed despite his obvious circumstances. "Your spot?" Blake asked, unconsciously taking a step back. "Been working this corner for 3 years," the man said, not unkindly. "Name's Pete. You're new to this, aren't you? Can tell by the backpack." "Too clean," Blake nodded, unsure how to respond. This was his first real conversation with a homeless person, and he felt completely out of his depth. "Come on," Pete said after a moment. "I know a place where they serve decent breakfast to folks like us. Could show you the ropes if you want. Streets can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." Blake hesitated, looking at the man who, 24 hours ago, he would have walked past without a second glance. Now, Pete might be the only person willing to help him survive the next month. "Yeah," Blake said finally. "I'd appreciate that." As they walked, Pete pointed out things Blake had never noticed before. Which businesses were friendly to homeless people, which corners were already claimed by other panhandlers, which alleys to avoid after dark. "Most important thing," Pete said as they approached a small church, "is to remember that everyone out here has a story. Nobody chooses this life, kid. Remember that." The church basement was already filling up with people when they arrived. The smell of coffee and pancakes filled the air, and volunteers in aprons moved between tables with trays of food. "Morning, Pete," one of the volunteers called out. "Who's your friend?" "This here's Blake," Pete said. "He's new to the streets. Figured I'd show him around, keep him from getting into trouble." The volunteer nodded sympathetically and handed them each a tray with pancakes, eggs, and coffee. Blake stared at the simple meal, his stomach growling. He hadn't eaten since yesterday's lunch at his usual expensive bistro. "First rule," Pete said as they sat down. "Never waste food. Out here you never know when your next meal is coming." As Blake ate, he listened to the conversations around him. A woman talking about losing her apartment after medical bills bankrupted her. A young man who'd lost his job and couldn't find new work without an address. An elderly couple who'd lost everything in the 2008 financial crisis and never recovered. These were the kind of people his father's company sometimes displaced when developing new properties. Blake had always viewed them as statistics on paper, numbers to be managed. Now they had faces, names, stories. "So what's your story, kid?" Pete asked as they finished eating. "Don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but you don't seem like the usual type we get out here." Blake considered lying, but remembered Pete's words about everyone having a story. "I'm learning a lesson," he said finally. "My father thinks I need to understand how the other half lives." Pete's eyebrows rose. "Tough love, huh? Well, you came to the right place for an education. Streets will teach you things no classroom ever could." As they left the church, Blake saw a familiar face walking past, Sarah Chen, one of his father's junior executives. She'd tried to present a project to him last week, but he'd blown off the meeting, too hungover to care. Now she walked past without a glance, her high heels clicking on the sidewalk. "That's another thing you'll learn," Pete said, noting Blake's reaction. "Being invisible takes some getting used to." Blake nodded, feeling a weight in his chest he'd never experienced before. This was only day one, and already his world had shifted on its axis. He had 29 more days to go, and he was starting to realize this wouldn't be the simple endurance test he'd first imagined. "Come on," Pete said, shouldering his own worn backpack. "Let me show you where you can safely store your stuff during the day. Then we'll talk about how to make a few dollars. Something tells me you've never had to work for money before." Blake followed, clutching his backpack straps tight. He had a feeling these would be the longest 30 days of his life, if he even made it that long. By his 5th day on the streets, Blake's hands were blistered and raw. Pete had shown him how to earn money by collecting recyclables from dumpsters, but the work was harder than anything Blake had ever done. His designer jeans were stained with coffee grounds and worse, and his carefully styled hair was matted with sweat. $8.30, Pete announced, counting their earnings from the day's bottles and cans. "Not bad for afternoon work. Split it 50-50? Blake stared at the 4 crumpled dollar bills and handful of change Pete was offering him. Last week, he'd spent more on a single cocktail than he'd earned in 5 hours of digging through garbage. "Keep it," Blake said, his voice hoarse. "You did most of the work anyway." Pete shook his head, pressing the money into Blake's hand. "First lesson of the streets. When someone offers you honest money, you take it. Pride's good, but it won't fill your stomach." They were sitting in a small park, their bags secured between their feet. Blake had learned the hard way about keeping his possessions safe after losing his jacket to a thief on his second night. The $200 his father had given him was already down to 43, and he was beginning to understand just how quickly money could disappear when every meal had to be paid for. "Speaking of stomachs," Pete said, standing up, "we should head to St. Michael's. They do dinner service on Thursdays, but the line gets long early." As they walked, Blake noticed how Pete greeted other homeless people by name, often stopping to share information about meals or weather warnings. There was a whole community here, invisible to the world Blake had come from, but very real and surprisingly organized. "Maria," Pete called out to an elderly woman pushing a shopping cart. "You heading to St. Michael's?" The woman shook her head, her face worried. "Can't today. Tommy's sick again. Need to check on him." "Who's Tommy?" Blake asked as they continued walking. "Maria's son. Got schizophrenia. She lost everything paying for his care after the insurance ran out." Pete's voice was matter-of-fact. "She lives on the street so she can stay near the shelter where he is. Visits him every day." Blake felt his throat tighten. He thought about his own mother, who had died when he was young. His father had spared no expense for her medical care, but not everyone had that luxury. The line at St. Michael's was already forming when they arrived. Blake recognized several faces from the morning breakfast service at the other church. A young woman caught his eye. She couldn't have been more than 20, clutching a backpack similar to his own. She looked as out of place as he felt. "That's Jenny," Pete whispered. "Ran away from something bad at home, that's all I know. Been here about 2 weeks." While they waited in line, Blake's phone buzzed. It was time for his mandatory check-in with his father. He stepped away from the line, ignoring the curious glances from others. "I'm alive," he said when his father answered. "Are you learning anything?" Richard Morrison's voice was neutral. Blake looked at the line of people waiting for a free meal, at Pete, who had shown him nothing but kindness, at Jenny, who was trying to hide her tears. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I'm learning a lot." "Good. Check in again in 3 days." The line moved slowly. While they waited, Pete told stories about the regulars, the former teacher who'd lost everything in a divorce, the veteran struggling with PTSD, the young man who worked 2 jobs but still couldn't afford rent in the city. Inside, the church hall was warm and smelled of pasta. Volunteers served generous portions of spaghetti with meat sauce, green beans, and bread. Blake noticed that many people were carefully wrapping extra bread in napkins, saving it for later. "Best meal of the week," Pete said as they found seats. "Eat slow. Make it last." Blake twirled spaghetti around his plastic fork, remembering business dinners at expensive Italian restaurants where he'd sent plates back for minor imperfections. Now, this simple meal tasted better than any 5-star cuisine he'd ever had. A commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A man had collapsed, shaking violently. "Diabetic," Pete said, already moving. "Hey, Marcus, you take your insulin today?" The man couldn't respond. Pete turned to the volunteers. "Call an ambulance. He needs help." Blake watched as Pete and others cared for the man until paramedics arrived. The efficiency and compassion of the response surprised him. These people, who had so little themselves, didn't hesitate to help others in need. That night, as Blake tried to find a comfortable position in his sleeping bag behind the church, Pete had shown him this relatively safe spot. He couldn't stop thinking about Marcus. Jenny, Maria, and all the others he'd met, each had a story that could have been prevented with money, the kind of money he'd thrown away on parties and cars. He thought about the development projects he'd ignored in board meetings, the displacement statistics he'd dismissed. How many more people had his family's company forced onto these streets? Rain began to fall, a gentle drizzle that slowly soaked through his sleeping bag. Blake pulled his backpack closer, using it as a pillow, and tried to ignore the growing dampness. Nearby, he could hear Pete's quiet snoring. The old man had insisted on staying close by, claiming it was safer to sleep near others you trusted. Trust. It was a strange thing to find here, among people who had every reason to be bitter and suspicious, yet in less than a week, he'd experienced more genuine human connection than he could remember in years of privileged isolation. A car alarm went off nearby, making Blake jump. He'd never get used to sleeping outside. Exposed to every sound and danger, his body ached from the hard ground and the day's work. Tomorrow, they'd have to find more bottles and cans, maybe try some of the dumpsters behind restaurants that Pete said sometimes threw out good food. The rain grew heavier. Water began to pool around his sleeping bag, and Blake realized he'd have to move or risk getting soaked. As he gathered his things, a figure approached through the darkness. "Rough night for sleeping," Pete's voice came quietly. "There's a shelter on Dover Street that might have space. It's a walk, but it's dry." Blake hesitated. He'd been avoiding the shelters, partly out of fear and partly out of shame. But as thunder rumbled overhead, he nodded. "Yeah, okay. Lead the way." As they walked through the rain-slick streets, Pete pointed out landmarks to help Blake navigate at night. They passed closing restaurants where well-dressed people hurried to their cars, carrying leftover containers that probably contained more food than Blake had eaten all day. "You're doing better than most newcomers," Pete said suddenly. "Most rich kids trying to rough it don't make it past the first night." Blake looked at him sharply. "How did you—" Pete chuckled. "Been on these streets 15 years. A kid. I can spot old money a mile away. Don't worry, your secret's safe with me. Figure you've got your reasons for being here." "My father's idea," Blake admitted, "teaching me a lesson about privilege and responsibility." "Is it working?" Blake thought about Marcus's seizure, about Maria's devotion to her son, about Jenny's hidden tears. "Yeah," he said softly, "it's working." The shelter was crowded but dry. As Blake lay on a narrow cot, listening to the sounds of dozens of other people trying to sleep, he realized something that shocked him. He was starting to see these people as people, not as problems or statistics. He thought about his father's words about understanding the value of people. Maybe that was the real lesson here, not just learning about poverty, but learning about humanity. Thunder crashed outside, but Blake was too tired to flinch. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more lessons, more stories. For now, he was grateful for his dry cot, for Pete's guidance, and for the growing awareness that was changing him in ways he never expected. 2 weeks into his street education, Blake sat in the back of St. Michael's during lunch service, watching Jenny teach a young homeless boy to read. His own clothes were now as worn as anyone else's, and the blisters on his hands had hardened into calluses. The $43 had dwindled to $12, carefully hidden in his sock. "She's good with kids," Pete said, sliding onto the bench beside him. "Used to be a teacher's aide before everything went wrong." Before Blake could respond, shouting erupted near the entrance. 2 men in expensive suits were speaking with Father Michael, their voices carrying across the quiet hall. Blake recognized them immediately, James Wilson and Derek Chang from Morrison Development's acquisitions team. "The church has a month to accept the offer," Wilson was saying, his voice hard. "After that, we'll pursue other options." Blake's stomach clenched. He knew what other options meant. His father's company would find ways to force the sale, usually through property tax challenges or building code violations. He'd sat through enough meetings to know the playbook. "This center serves over 200 people daily," Father Michael argued. "Where will they go?" "That's not our concern," Chang replied. "The developer has plans for the entire block. You can't stop progress." Blake watched the color drain from Father Michael's face. He knew the priest had been fighting to keep the center open, but he hadn't realized his father's company was behind the pressure to close it. "Progress?" Pete muttered beside him. "That's what they call it when they throw people out on the street?" Blake felt sick. 2 weeks ago, he would have been on the other side of this conversation, maybe even leading it. Now, He looked around at the faces he'd come to know. Maria feeding Tommy, his medication in the corner. Jenny with her young student, Marcus, carefully measuring his insulin dose. The suits left, leaving behind a heavy silence. Father Michael looked older than Blake had ever seen him, the weight of 200 lives pressing down on his shoulders. "They'll close us down," the priest said to no one in particular. "They always win." Blake stood up suddenly, surprising Pete. "I need to make a phone call." Outside, his hands trembling, Blake dialed his father's number on the burner phone. It rang twice before Richard Morrison's familiar voice answered. "You're early for your check-in. Call off Wilson and Chang," Blake said without preamble. "St. Michael's isn't just a property deal." There was a long pause. "You're there now?" "Yes. And I've been here every day for 2 weeks. This place keeps people alive, Dad. Real people with real stories. If you close it..." "This is business, Blake," his father interrupted. "The deal's worth millions. One soup kitchen..." "It's not just a soup kitchen." Blake's voice rose, drawing looks from passers-by. "It's insulin for Marcus. It's a safe place for Jenny to teach kids. It's where Maria can make sure Tommy takes his meds. These are people, not numbers on a spreadsheet." "You're getting emotional," Richard said coolly. "This is exactly why..." "Why what? Why you put me out here?" "Well, congratulations, Dad. I'm learning exactly what you wanted me to learn. I'm learning that every time we buy a building or develop a property, we're affecting real lives. But I'm also learning that we have the power to do better." Another pause. "Longer this time." "What are you suggesting?" Blake took a deep breath. "Buy the property, but instead of demolishing it, renovate it. Expand the center. Make it better, not gone. Show people that Morrison Developments can be about more than just profit. That would cost millions more than the current plan." "Then take it from my trust fund," Blake said without hesitation. "All of it. I don't care about the money anymore, Dad. I care about doing what's right." The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice different somehow. "You'd give up your entire inheritance for this place?" "Yes," Blake said firmly, "because these people have taught me more about value and dignity in 2 weeks than I learned in 23 years of privilege." "Come to my office," Richard said after a moment. "Now." Blake felt panic rise in his throat. "I still have 2 weeks left." "Now, Blake. We need to talk." The line went dead. Blake stared at the phone, then at the church entrance where Pete stood watching him. "Everything okay, kid?" Pete asked. "I don't know," Blake answered honestly. "I have to go somewhere. I'll try to come back." Pete nodded, understanding in his weathered face. "Do what you need to do. We'll be here." The walk to Morrison Developments headquarters took 30 minutes. Blake felt every step, aware of how different he looked now, how much he had changed. The security guard didn't recognize him at first, and even after checking his ID, kept giving him suspicious looks. In the elevator, Blake caught his reflection in the polished doors. His face was tanned and weathered, his designer stubble replaced by a genuine unkempt beard. His clothes were stained and worn. He looked like the kind of person he used to avoid eye contact with on the street. His father's secretary gasped when he entered the office, but Richard Morrison showed no reaction to his son's transformed appearance. "Sit down," Richard said, gesturing to the chair where, just 2 weeks ago, Blake had received his street sentence. Blake remained standing. "The center stays open." "Enter. That's non-negotiable." Richard studied him for a long moment. "You really would give up your inheritance for this?" "Yes." "Why?" Blake thought about Pete's kindness, about Jenny's dedication to teaching despite her own problems, about Maria's love for her son. "Because I finally understand what real value is," he said quietly. "It's not in property or profit. It's in people, in community, in doing what's right even when it's not profitable." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "You know, your mother used to say something similar. She was always pushing me to think beyond the bottom line." Blake felt tears prick at his eyes at the mention of his mother. Richard turned back to face his son. "The center stays," he said, "and we'll fund the renovation, not from your trust fund, but from the company's community investment budget. I think it's time Morrison Development showed a different side to the city." Blake felt his knees go weak with relief. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Richard said, a hint of his old sternness returning. "You still have 2 weeks left on the streets. And when you come back, you're going to be in charge of our new Community Impact Division, starting from the bottom, learning every aspect. No shortcuts this time." Blake nodded, understanding both the responsibility and the opportunity his father was offering. "Now go," Richard said. "You look like you could use a meal, and I believe St. Michael's serves dinner at 6. As Blake turned to leave, his father spoke again. "Blake, I'm proud of you, son. Your mother would be too." The words hit him harder than any of the physical discomforts of the past 2 weeks. Blake hurried out before his father could see his tears. Blake returned to St. Michael's that evening with a light heart, but kept the news to himself. He wanted to earn the right to share it, to prove he wasn't just another rich kid playing at being homeless. The next morning, he was back collecting cans with Pete, his muscles aching but his mind clearer than ever. "Something's different about you," Pete observed as they sorted through recyclables. "You're standing straighter." Blake shrugged, concentrating on separating aluminum from plastic. "Maybe I'm finally getting used to the work." "Nah, it's more than that." Pete studied him with those wise eyes that seemed to see everything. "You found your purpose, didn't you?" Before Blake could respond, they heard shouting from the alley entrance. 3 young men were hassling Jenny, who was clutching her backpack protectively. Blake recognized them as the same group that had been causing trouble at the shelter earlier that week. Without thinking, Blake stepped forward. "Hey, leave her alone!" The largest of the 3 turned, sizing up Blake with contempt. "Mind your own business, rich boy. Yeah, we know who you are. Been watching you play homeless with the rest of these losers." Blake felt Pete tense beside him, ready to jump in if needed. But something had changed in Blake over the past weeks. He wasn't the same person who would have called security to handle a problem. "You're right," Blake said calmly, moving to stand between Jenny and her harassers. "I'm not really homeless. I'm here by choice, which means I can walk away any time. But I'm choosing to stay. I'm choosing to stand here. What does that tell you about how serious I am?" The leader hesitated, thrown off by Blake's calm confidence. But his friend wasn't so easily deterred, lunging forward with a wild punch. Blake sidestepped, thankful for the boxing lessons his father had insisted on years ago. The attacker stumbled off balance, and Blake used his momentum to push him away from Jenny. "Enough!" Pete's voice boomed through the alley. He'd been quietly gathering reinforcements. Marcus, Tommy, and several others from the community stood behind him. "This isn't your territory. Leave." The 3 troublemakers, outmanned and outmaneuvered, backed away with muttered threats. Once they were gone, Blake turned to Jenny. "You okay?" She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, both of you." "Community looks after its own," Pete said simply. The words hit Blake hard. Community. In 3 weeks, he'd become part of something he'd never truly understood before. These people, whom he once would have crossed the street to avoid, had become his friends, his teachers, his defenders. That evening, during the dinner service, Blake noticed Jenny working with twice as many children as usual. Word had spread about the morning's incident, and parents who had been hesitant to leave their kids with a stranger now trusted her completely. "You did good today, kid," Pete said, sitting down beside him. "But those guys might come back. Streets have a long memory." Blake nodded, understanding the warning. "I need to tell you something, Pete, about who I really am." Over the next hour, as the dinner crowd thinned, Blake told Pete everything. About his father, about Morrison developments, about the center's threatened closure and how he'd stopped it. Pete listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. "So that's why you're really here," Pete said finally. "Your father wanted you to understand the impact of your company's decisions." "Yes," Blake admitted, "but it became more than that. You, Jenny, Maria, Tommy, you're not just lessons to me anymore. You're people I care about, people I want to help, but not from a distance. I want to work with the community, not just for it." Pete was quiet for a long moment. "You know, in 15 years on these streets, I've seen a lot of rich folks doing charity. They come, they serve some food, they feel good about themselves, and they leave. But you, You lived it. You learned. That makes you different. I don't want to just write checks, Blake said. When I go back, I'm going to be running a new division focused on community impact. I want to do it right. Will you help me? Pete raised an eyebrow. Me? Who better? You know everyone, understand everything about life on the streets. I need someone who'll tell me the truth, keep me honest. The position pays well, includes housing. Stop, Pete held up a hand. I don't need charity. It's not charity, Blake insisted. It's a job offer, one you're uniquely qualified for. Think about how many people you could help from the inside. Pete stared at his worn shoes for a long time. Let me think about it. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Blake continued his routine of can collecting and meal services, but now he was also quietly observing, taking mental notes about what the community really needed. He watched how people helped each other, how information spread, how the informal support networks functioned. Jenny's reading classes grew larger, and Blake found himself sitting in occasionally, learning as much from her patience and dedication as the children did from their lessons. He saw how education could be a way out, but only if it came with understanding and support. Maria showed him how she managed Tommy's medication schedule, despite having no home, no computer, no fancy pill organizers. Her system of notes and reminders, developed through necessity, was more efficient than any app Blake had ever seen. Marcus taught him about the challenges of managing chronic illness on the streets, about how a simple thing like keeping insulin cool became a daily struggle. Blake started researching portable cooling solutions, making notes for future projects. One evening, as Blake sat on the church steps watching the sunset, Father Michael joined him. Your father's architects were here today, the priest said. The renovation plans look promising. More space for classes, a proper medical clinic, expanded kitchen facilities. Blake nodded. We're going to do it right this time. Build something that really serves the community's needs. You know, Father Michael said thoughtfully, when you first arrived, I thought you were just another rich kid trying to prove something. I was wrong. You've become part of this community. They taught me more than I could ever teach them, Blake admitted. That's usually how it works. The priest smiled. The best teachers are often those who think they're students. As his final week on the streets began, Blake found himself torn between excitement about returning to his old life and sadness about leaving this new community. But he was no longer the same person who had arrived with a clean backpack and expensive clothes. He had been transformed, not just by hardship, but by the unexpected friendships and lessons he'd found among those he once ignored. On his last morning on the streets, Blake woke before sunrise. He lay on his thin sleeping mat, listening to the city slowly come alive around him. 30 days had passed like both an eternity and an instant. His father's lesson had worked in ways neither of them could have predicted. Pete was already awake, organizing his few possessions with military precision. Big day, kid. Yeah, Blake said softly. Hard to believe it's over. Over? Pete chuckled. Nah, it's just beginning. The real test isn't surviving out here. It's what you do with what you learned when you go back. They made their usual rounds one last time. Breakfast at the church, collecting cans in their familiar territory, helping Jenny set up her morning reading circle. Blake had already told most of the community it was his last day, and the goodbyes were harder than he'd expected. You'll come back to visit, right? Tommy asked during lunch, his medication schedule clutched in his hand. Mom says you're going to make things better. Blake squeezed the young man's shoulder. I'm not just going to visit, Tommy. I'm going to be working with Father Michael on the renovation. You'll probably get sick of seeing me. At 3 o'clock, Blake changed into the clean clothes his father had sent over. A simple suit that felt alien after a month in worn jeans and t-shirts. He'd kept his beard but trimmed it neatly. Looking in the shelter's clouded mirror, he barely recognized himself. The eyes that stared back were older, wiser, filled with purpose. Well, look at you, Pete said from the doorway. Almost look respectable again. Blake turned to his mentor, the man who had taught him more about life in 30 days than he'd learned in 23 years of privilege. Have you thought about my offer? Pete nodded slowly. Did some asking around about your father's company, about the changes you're planning. Sounds like you're serious about this community impact stuff. Dead serious, Blake confirmed. But I need help from someone who really understands what people here need. Someone they trust. Yeah, well, Pete straightened his worn jacket. Can't let you mess it up, can I? But I have conditions. Name them. First, I keep my independence. No fancy office, no suit and tie. I need to stay connected to the community, not locked away in some corporate tower. Blake nodded. Agreed. What else? Second, we hire from within the community when possible. Jenny for the education programs, Marcus to help coordinate medical services, real jobs with real wages, not charity. Already in the plans. Blake smiled. And third, Pete's weathered face grew serious. You stay real. Kid, don't let that world up there make you forget what you learned down here. These people trusted you with their stories. Don't waste that trust. Blake held out his hand. Deal. Instead of shaking it, Pete pulled him into a rough hug. Proud of you, kid. You did good. At 4 o'clock, Blake stood outside Morrison Development's headquarters. His worn backpack, now containing 30 days of hard-earned wisdom, slung over his expensive suit. The security guard, who had barely recognized him a week ago, now smiled and held the door. His father was waiting in the lobby, not the office. It was the first time they'd seen each other since Blake's intervention for St. Michael's. Welcome back, son, Richard Morrison said, studying his transformed son carefully. You look different. I am different, Blake replied simply. They rode the elevator in silence. When they reached the executive floor, instead of turning toward his father's office, Richard led him to a newly renovated space on the opposite side. Your new division, Richard explained, opening the door to reveal a large open-plan office. Community impact and sustainable development. Budget's been approved by the board. You'll have full autonomy, but you'll need to show results. Blake walked through the space, noting the multiple meeting areas, the casual seating arrangements, the walls ready for photos and project plans. We'll show results, not just in numbers, but in lives changed. Your mother would have loved this, Richard said quietly. She always said we had a responsibility to build communities, not just buildings. Blake turned to his father. Why didn't you ever tell me about her work with homeless communities? Richard looked surprised. How did you? Pete told me. Apparently, she used to volunteer at St. Michael's 20 years ago. That's the real reason you chose this lesson for me, isn't it? Richard nodded slowly. She would have been disappointed in how far we'd strayed from her vision, in how far I'd let you stray from the values she believed in. I thought this might help you find your way back. It did more than that, Blake said. It helped me find my own way forward. A knock at the door interrupted them. Pete stood there, still in his worn clothes but with a new purpose in his stance. Behind him were Jenny, Marcus, and several other familiar faces from the community. Hope we're not too early, Pete said. Thought we should see where we'll be working. Richard looked at his son questioningly. Blake smiled. Dad, I'd like you to meet my team, the real experts in community impact. Over the next few months, Morrison Developments underwent a transformation that made headlines in the business world. The St. Michael's renovation became a model for community-centered development, combining social services with affordable housing and job training programs. Jenny's reading program expanded into a full educational center, offering GED classes and job skills training. Marcus helped establish a medical clinic that provided care for chronic conditions, making it easier for people like Tommy to manage their health. Pete, true to his word, never wore a suit or worked from an office. Instead, he became Morrison Development's eyes and ears on the street, identifying needs and opportunities that traditional market research would have missed. 1 year after his 30 days on the streets, Blake stood on the roof of the renovated St. Michael's Center, watching the sunset over the city. The building now housed 30 formerly homeless families, including Maria and Tommy, and provided services for hundreds more. Penny for your thoughts? Pete joined him at the railing. still in his worn jacket despite his healthy salary. "Just thinking about how different everything was a year ago," Blake replied. "I was so lost, so empty. And now," Blake smiled, looking down at the community garden where residents were finishing their day's work. Jenny was there with her adult education class, teaching in the open air. Maria was helping Tommy tend their small plot of vegetables. New faces mixed with familiar ones, all part of a community that was growing stronger every day. "Now I know exactly who I am and what I'm meant to do," Pete nodded approvingly. "Your mother would be proud, both of you," he added, as Richard Morrison emerged from the roof access door. "The board meeting went well," Richard announced. "They've approved expansion of the program to 3 more locations." "With comprehensive support services?" Blake asked. "Full package," Richard confirmed. "Housing, education, healthcare, job training, the Morrison model, they're calling it." Blake shook his head. "The community model. We just helped make it happen." As the sun set over the city, Blake thought about the lesson his father had tried to teach him. It had worked better than either of them could have imagined, transforming not just one privileged young man, but an entire company's approach to business and community development. More importantly, it had shown that real change was possible when privilege and power were used to uplift rather than overshadow, to support rather than suppress. The 30 days that were meant to humble him had instead empowered him to help others rise. "Ready for tomorrow?" Pete asked. "We've got that meeting with the East Side community leaders." Blake nodded, already thinking about the possibilities ahead. "Always ready. There's still so much work to do." "That's my boy," Pete grinned. "Never satisfied until everyone has a chance at a better life." As they headed inside, Blake paused for one last look at the sunset. His father's lesson had taught him more than the value of money or the importance of compassion. It had taught him that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in lives improved, in communities strengthened, in hope restored. And that was a lesson worth more than any inheritance could ever be. What would you do in Blake's position? Do you think his father made the right decision by sending him to live on the streets? I'd love to read your thoughts about this story in the comments below. If stories about personal transformation and redemption touch your heart as much as they touch mine, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We post new, inspiring stories every week. On my right, you'll find another moving story about how money and power can change people's lives, both for better and worse. And on my left, a story about a life lesson that changed an entire family's destiny. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. Your support means a lot to us and helps us continue sharing these stories that make us reflect on life and the values that truly matter. See you in the next story.